Hi, Dr. P here, and I'm going to try to convince you of the futility of striving to get a great idea or coming up with a great innovation for a game. And a lot of beginners think that it's a great idea that makes a game successful, and I'm going to show you that it's not. And also I'm going to show you that great ideas are so rare that it just doesn't make sense to expend a lot of effort trying to come up with one. Because what will happen is you'll keep rejecting ideas that might turn into really good games but aren't terribly original. No, I think great ideas just happen provided you're trying to get ideas. And of course, it's not really the idea that matters, it's the game. And a game is something that gradually builds up from the original conception through the prototype, playtesting, and so on. And often games don't turn out as they were originally conceived. In fact, probably more commonly, a game when you finish it is not what you had in mind when you set out. And that's true whether it's a tabletop game or a video game, and perhaps more true of video games than of tabletop games. So that's the summary. Now, why do I say this? Well, let's list some quote-unquote great ideas, something that began a category of tabletop games first, and then we'll do video games. Dungeons and Dragons is an obvious one. It's an avatar-based game, and all the avatar-based games pretty much descend from Dungeons and Dragons, including a great many video games. It's also a game that doesn't have an ending. It's a never-ending adventure, and it's a game with no win condition. In fact, some people would say role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons aren't games at all. I would disagree with them. You don't need to have a win condition for a game, but before Dungeons and Dragons, virtually all games had win conditions. So there's one. Another one, Magic the Gathering. Oddly enough, this is more an innovation in marketing than in the actual game. The innovation in marketing is collectible games. It's a scheme to get people to continue spending money on an individual game. It's very clever, but it's not actually a groundbreaking game so much as a groundbreaking marketing scheme. How about Dominion? I don't think Dominion has quite had the impact of the first two games, but certainly there are now hundreds of deck building games out there, and all descended from Dominion. But if you try to list some more great ideas in tabletop games, it's not easy to come up with them, and you might have to go back a long, long way. Well, let's consider subcategories. There are games that have started subgenres, like card-driven war games, my own game Britannia. Either way, even if we add the subcategories, we're talking about less than a game a year, less than one game in now many hundreds. And if we stick to the notion that it's a great game idea, we're at one game per decade. Dungeons and Dragons is from the 70s. Magic is from the 90s. Dominion, quite recent. Okay, now how about video games? Of course, a lot of video games actually derive from Dungeons and Dragons or from simple puzzles. It's also very noticeable in video games that video game genres have a beginning, but often the most famous early game in a genre is not the first game of the genre. For example, The Sims is a very well-known game, but it was preceded a long way by a game called Little Computer People. Now, I've never played that game, I don't know much about it, but I understand it was the same kind of thing as The Sims. And you probably haven't heard of it either. But it was the first. Investigate video game genres, and you're likely to find out that the originating game is not the most well known. In fact, unless you find the right articles, they won't even list the originating game. They'll list the game that became well known. Now consider, in the 40-some year history of video games, how many video game genres do we have? Certainly not more than 40-some. So that's one a year. Are you going to spend a lot of your time trying to find something that only happens once a year? That's probably not wise. Now consider also, many of the biggest money makers of recent times haven't been terrifically innovative, have not been the first game in a genre. Even Minecraft, which comes close, was preceded by Dwarf Fortress and other games. Angry Birds, Clash of the Clans, Candy Crush Saga, they all had predecessors, often many predecessors, often just as good. It's just that something happened. In effect, they got lucky. Their timing was really good. What's the point? Innovative video games often aren't the really successful games. Now, do you think that the designers of these games that I've been talking about were trying to make the great innovation? I think that rarely they were. It just happened while they were trying to make the best game they could make. In any case, if you consider how rarely these games occur, it's futile to try to make the next great innovation in games. The odds are just way too far against you. You'll be spinning your wheels instead of doing something useful. Now, I can give you a personal example here because my game Britannia is fairly well known among wargamers. It was originally published in 1986, printed over the years in several languages and several editions. It's a game about 1,000 years of British history, which led to the Sweep of History game category and the Britannia-like games in particular. And there are somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen other Britannia-like games that I did not design, that other people have designed, but have been published. What was I doing? Was I trying to establish a new category? Hell no! I was just trying to make a game that represented the very long history of the British Isles well, and more importantly, was a good game. Moreover, a key feature of the game, control of several nations by each player, actually comes from a game called Ancient Conquest I, though in every other way Britannia is quite different. I'll bet you never heard of Ancient Conquest I. Of course, you may never heard of Britannia, but a lot of people have heard of Britannia, not many of Ancient Conquest I, even though it's back in print nowadays from Excalibur Games. So my strong advice here is focus on making good games. Focus on making the best game you can make. Don't focus on trying to find a great idea that becomes a great game. That's a fool's errand.